That's how foolish problem children are. This is just further proof that Esau didn't deserve the birthright. Now, if you remember, God knew that Esau would be this way when he was still in the womb. That's why he told Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. He reversed the Hebraism. Tonight we're going to be studying the story of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob. So turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 25. And what I want to do is read the entire story starting in verse number 27. Now when I say the entire story, don't worry. It only goes to verse 34 and we're starting at verse 27. So it's relatively short. And I'm going to read it in the King James Version. And the reason I'm going to do that is because tonight as we go through it verse by verse, I'm going to be using different translations, the ones that I feel like are closer to the original meaning of what the Hebrew says. And as a result of that, I can't just read the entire story going from different translations. So what I'm going to do is read it in the King James Version. So follow along with me as I read the story. And the boys grew up, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I'm at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he swore unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, if you've been a Christian for any length of time, I know that you're familiar with this story, especially if you grew up in church. Because if you grew up in church, you probably went to Sunday school and you went to vacation Bible school. And this is one of the favorite stories in the Old Testament because we're trying to come in and contrast the character of Jacob and Esau. But what I hope to do tonight is show you some things that you probably have never seen before so that you see this through God's eyes, not our eyes. So let's study the story verse by verse, beginning in verse number 27. It says, and the boys grew up, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that Esau and Jacob weren't boys when this event occurred. People, they were men. They had grown up, and most likely they were in their early 20s. And that's a very important detail because the author is letting us know what they grew up to be. Esau grew up to be a cunning hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob grew up to be a plain man who dwelt in tents. In other words, Esau grew up to be an irresponsible son, and Jacob grew up to be a responsible son. Now, how do I know that? I know that because of the way they're described. And if you'd been raised in a Jewish home and you could read the story in the original Hebrew, you would automatically come to the conclusion that Esau grew up to be irresponsible and Jacob grew up to be responsible. And let me show you why you would have come to that conclusion based upon the way they were described. First, let's look at the way that Esau was described. Esau grew up to be a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Now, as I said, if you were raised in a Jewish home and you were able to read the story in the original Hebrew, immediately you would know that Esau liked to play, not work. You see, in ancient Israel, hunting was a sport, not a profession. Let me say that again. Hunting was a sport, not a profession. The way you earned your living was by raising domesticated animals, animals such as sheep, goats, cattle, and by farming. Now, Isaac was more of a rancher than he was a farmer. Yes, he did grow crops. In fact, as we go along a little bit later, we're going to see a story where a famine comes, and Isaac went ahead and he sowed, he planted his seed, and he reaped 100-fold. So we do know that he did farm. But I want you to understand that he was more of a rancher than he was a farmer. He had lots and lots of herds of different kinds of domesticated animals. And trust me, he was a very, very rich man. If you remember, Abraham was a very, very rich man. In fact, today we would say that Abraham was filthy rich. Look at Genesis chapter 13, verse number 2. And Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And if Abraham lived today, you would have all of these people wanting to come in and protest as he was on Wall Street. I'm just teasing. Now, he was a very, very rich man, and almost every bit of it went to Isaac. So Isaac was a very, very rich man. And he had more cattle and more sheep and more goats than he knew what to do with. So Esau did not have to hunt for a living, not to put meat on the table. If you wanted meat, you could have had meat every night of the week. Why? Because that's all he had was sheep and goats and cattle. So why did he hunt? He did it because he liked to do it. And like most kids who's born into a rich family, he spent his time doing what he wanted to do, hunting rather than working, and Daddy indulged him. Now, look back at the way that Esau is described. And the boys grew up, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Now, when you read that he was a man of the field, what does that make you think? It makes you think that he liked the outdoors, so he watched over Daddy's flocks and herds, right? Wrong. You have to go deeper and do a word study. You see, the word field is translated from the Hebrew word sadeh. And in this context, it means wilderness or uninhabited land, the place where wild animals roamed. So what this is saying is that Esau liked to go on hunting trips. And that's what he spent all of his time doing. Instead of working, he spent all of his time hunting and fishing, doing what he loved to do. But my point is this. Every Jew who would read this story immediately knew that Esau was irresponsible. He liked to play rather than work. And Daddy was an enabler. Daddy indulged him. He didn't make him work. And he allowed him to spend all of his time hunting, just like most kids in rich families do. Now, look at the way that Jacob is described. Look back at verse 27. And the boys grew up, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. Now, I want you to underline the word plain. Now, before I tell you what this word means, let me ask you a question. When you hear the word plain, what do you think of? If I said that someone was a plain Jane, what would you think that I meant by that? Unattractive. Ordinary. You would think that I meant that there was nothing special about her. She's not pretty, but she's not ugly. She's not outgoing, but neither is she a wallflower. She's just plain. She has no characteristics that makes her stand out. She's kind of homely. So when we read that Jacob was a plain man, we tend to think that he really wasn't special. There was really nothing special about him. But people, that's not what this word means. Not in the original Hebrew. You see, this word plain is translated from the Hebrew word tom. If we were to transliterate this word, we would spell it T-A-W-M, tom. It's used 14 times in the Old Testament. 9 times it's translated as perfect. Twice it's translated as undefiled. And twice as upright. In fact, let me show you how this word is used in the book of Job when it's talking about Job. Turn to Job chapter 1, verse number 8. Notice what God says to Satan when they're talking about Job. And the Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Now, let me just give you a little insight into this. This doesn't have anything to do with the story that we're studying, but I think it's important that you know. God was not pointing Job out to Satan. He knew that Satan had already been looking at him. So basically, how this says it in the original Hebrew is, you've been considering my servant Job, haven't you? Anyways, the Lord said unto Satan, you've been considering my servant Job, haven't you? There is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Now I want you to underline that word perfect there. It's translated from the Hebrew word tom. It means righteous, upright. But more specifically, it refers to a man who does the right thing, both in the natural and in the spiritual. So why in the world did the English translators translate it as plain in Genesis chapter 25, verse number 27? Well, I'll tell you why. Because in 1611, when they translated the Bible into English, the word plain meant sincere or upright. But today it doesn't mean that. So as we're reading along in the King James Version and we see that he was a plain man, we're going, a plain Jane. No distinguishing characteristic, nothing special about him. He wasn't good looking, but he wasn't ugly. He's probably kind of homely. He was a mama's boy, right? Not at all. So here's my point. Every Jewish person who could read Hebrew and who read this story immediately knew that Jacob was an upright man, a man who did the right thing, a man who fulfilled his responsibilities. Now, we're going to look at some things that he does later on, but he does these things trying to do the right thing in the wrong way. Plus, mama's not helping him. But he's really got a good heart. And he's a man after God's heart. He's just going about it in the wrong way, like many of us do. In fact, I want you to look back at verse number 27, and I want you to see how else Jacob is described. It says, Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. Now, what does he mean, dwelling in tents? In other words, he didn't go wandering off doing his own thing. No, he stayed at home tending to the family business, and he was the one the parents could depend on. And many times he was the one that would go out because they had to put their flocks in different fields, that he would go out and take a tent with them to stay to make sure everything was going right. So you've got one son that's irresponsible, that wants to wander off and go do his own thing and to hunt. And you've got another son that's very responsible. He's someone that's described as Tom. He does the right things both naturally and spiritually, and he stays at home and he's learning the family business to do what mom and dad wants. He's the one the parents can depend on. Now, look at verse number 28. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So as you can see, Isaac and Rebekah had favorites. Isaac's favorite was Esau, but not for the reason you think. We read that, and at face value, it makes it think like, woo, daddy liked to eat. Isaac must have been a big fat man, and he just loved Esau because he went out, he killed all of this wild game, and he would just make a big feast out of it. No, you have to read between the lines and dig a little bit deeper. So his favorite was Esau, but not for the reasons you think. And Rebekah's favorite was Jacob. And this favoritism is what ends up causing great problems in the family. But that's another story. We'll get to those stories. Now, I want you to notice why Isaac loved Esau. At face value, it says, because he did eat of his venison. Now, I want you to underline the word venison. When we think of venison, what do we think of? Deer meat. He loved deer. But that's not what it means. It simply means wild game. You see, the word venison is translated from the Hebrew word satyed, which means wild game. So Isaac liked to eat the wild game that Esau killed. But there's more to it than that. And let me explain why I say that. We find out later in the story, when we get to more of the seedy part of the story, that Rebekah could prepare goat meat in such a way that Isaac couldn't tell the difference between it and the wild game that Esau killed. Turn to Genesis chapter 27, and let's read verses 6 through 9. Rebekah said to her son Jacob, look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. You go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it. Now, if you're familiar with the story, Jacob goes, I don't know about that, Mama. What if we do that and he finds out I'm not Esau? Then I'm going to be cursed, not blessed. And Mama says, you don't worry about that. You let me handle the old man. You just go out and get me 2 young goats. And she prepares the goat meat. And when he takes it in there and Isaac eats it, he can't tell the difference between the 2 goats that she prepared and the wild game that Esau had been cooking. So why did Isaac favor Esau? Because there had to be more to it than the fact that he liked eating the wild game and Esau killed, especially when you consider the fact that Rebekah could prepare goat meat to taste just like wild game. So what made Isaac favor Esau over Jacob? Well, this is where you have to dig, because it goes back to the fact that Esau was a problem child. Let me say it again. Esau was a problem child. He wouldn't work. All he wanted to do was hunt and fish. He was rebellious. As you study his life, you find out that he actually married Canaanite women simply because his parents didn't want him to do that. In fact, he was so rebellious, whatever his parents said, he did the exact opposite. He was one of those kids that if you said clean your room, he'd just sit on the bed. If you told him to stay in the house, he went outside. If you told him to stay outside and not come in, he came in. That's the way he was. Not only that, but he never considered the consequences of his actions. In fact, when you see the things that he does, it's kind of interesting. But he never considers the consequences of his actions, and he basically did whatever he wanted. He's the perfect example of a problem child. And that's why, listen to me, that's why his father was partial to him. Yeah. Believe it or not, it happens all the time. In fact, let me explain something to you about the dynamics of a family with a problem child in it. With almost every family that has a problem child in it, there's usually one parent that favors the problem child without even realizing it. And if you ask them if they did that, they would say, no. But they do. And the reason they do is because of the praxis principle. How many of you remember the praxis principle? How many of you don't remember the praxis principle? All right, let me give you the praxis principle and write this down. The way we treat people affects the way we feel about them. Let me say that again. The way we treat people affects the way we feel about them. That's why Jesus told us to love our enemies. That's why Jesus told us to pray for those who despitefully use us. That's why we're supposed to love everyone. And remember, that word love is agape. It is not a feeling, it's a behavior. Because God knows that if we behave in the right way towards someone, eventually it affects the way we feel about them. And I talked about that with marriage. If a husband does not treat his wife right, trust me, in several years he will fall out of love with her. Why? Because the way we treat people affects the way we feel about them. But if he treats his wife right the way that he should, it will affect the way he feels about it. It doesn't matter how old she gets, how wrinkled she looks, how gray her hair is, how much weight she puts on. If he treats her like a queen, he will feel like she's a queen. Why? Because of the praxis principle. And the praxis principle explains why in almost every family that has a problem child in it, there's usually one parent that favors the problem child without even realizing it. You see, when Isaac and Rebekah started having problems with Esau, Isaac did what most fathers do. He started making excuses for Esau's character. Or I should say, he was making excuses for his lack of character. Think about it. Isaac and Rebekah had 2 kids. One was always doing what he was supposed to do. That was Jacob. The Bible says that he was a plain man. The word plain is translated from the Hebrew word tom, and it means that he does the right things, both naturally and spiritually. So he was a plain man. He was consistently doing the right thing. When Esau was out playing and doing whatever he wanted, Jacob was in the tents. He was learning the family business. He was doing what mom and dad wanted him to do. He was the responsible one. Now, the other child, Esau, didn't, and he was always getting into trouble. So Isaac started making excuses for the way he acted and for his character, which just enabled him to continue being irresponsible and rebellious. And to compensate for the guilt that he felt, the guilt that every parent of a problem child feels, he gave him preferential treatment without even realizing it. Now, what do you mean, preferential treatment? In other words, he did not hold Esau to the same standard that he held Jacob. And that's what happens with the problem child in the family. We hold everyone else to this standard. Every one of the children that can go to the standard, we hold them to this. But when the problem child comes along, we don't hold them to the same standard. Why did he not hold him to the same standard as Jacob? Because number one, he thought he would never live up to that standard. So he gave up trying to make him do that. And number two, he was tired of the fights it caused. So he just allowed Esau to do just about anything he wanted to do, which is preferential treatment, especially in the eyes of the other children. Not only that, but like most parents of a problem child, Isaac looked for anything positive that he could praise Esau for, no matter how small it was. And the only thing that Esau really excelled at, read the story, people, there's only one thing. He was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. In other words, he liked to go on hunting trips. So guess what Isaac did? He did what most fathers do with a problem child, especially if it's a boy. He focused on that one good thing, and he started praising him for that. Wow, Esau, you're a great hunter. I love to eat your venison. Well, Mama was probably throwing the venison out because she could make the wild goat or the goats that they had taste just like the wild animals. She was fixing it just the way he liked it. But you see, he was so focused on Esau because he worried about him, because his heart went out, and he tried everything with him. Now, in cases like this, the focus is so directed towards the problem child to try and help the child. The other children are usually neglected. That's the way it happens in a home with problem children. And when you consider the praxis principle, you can see how this leads to favoritism, and that's what happened to Esau. Now, sometimes both parents become guilty of that, but usually it's not that way. Study families of problem children. I challenge you to do that. Go buy books of psychologists that have done studies on this. And you know what you'll find? Usually there's only one parent that does that, and the other parent kind of reacts the other way. And that's what happened to Esau. Now, Rebekah, as I said, went the other way. She disagreed with the way that Isaac dealt with the problem. So what she focused on was the good child. And when you consider the praxis principle, you can see how it led to favoritism. She loved Jacob because he was the responsible child, the dependable child, the good child, the child that did what he was supposed to do, the child that was learning the family business, the child that was respectful, the child that if you told him, don't do that, he didn't do it. Not Esau when she said, don't walk into the tent with muddy feet. He just walked on in. I've been hunting and I'm tired. And you just get tired of fighting with him. And she would go to Isaac, and she would say, he won't do what I say. You need to discipline him. I've tried everything. Let's praise him. So he went that way. She went the other way. And so what we find is when they describe this, and see, the problem with us is not being raised in a Jewish home and not understanding Hebrew. When we read verse number 27, we don't understand what it's saying. He was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Wow, that's good. No. Every Jew in the time of Jesus and before Jesus would read that and go, oh my, what an irresponsible kid, a problem child. And then we read that Jacob was a plain man. He dwelt in tents. Oh, bless his heart. No. Every Jew who understood that from the time of Jesus and back and even forward, and even today, if you understand Hebrew, you read that and you go, Jacob was a good child. He did what he was told. And so what we see is that the parents did exactly what happens to families with a problem child in it. One parent went one way and favored one child, and the other parent went the opposite way and favored the other child. So Isaac favored Esau because of the praxis principle. The way you treat people is the way you feel about him. And he was always having to work with Esau and treat him. Finally, he gives into it. But boy, he does have special feelings. Rebekah comes the other way. She's spending time with him. He's doing what a good boy he is. And so she loves Jacob. And you've got this favoritism going on. Verse 29. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. Now the word sod is translated from the Hebrew word zud, which means to boil. And the word pottage is translated from the Hebrew word nazid, which means soup or stew. So what Jacob was doing was boiling some type of soup Now, later on it says stew, but they're really the same thing from the Hebrew word. So he was boiling soup. And about the time it was ready, Esau came home from one of his hunting trips. Notice it says that he came in from the field. Now, the word field refers to the uninhabited land, the place where wild animals roam. So Esau had been out on a hunting trip, and the implication is he hadn't killed anything on his 2 or 3 day walkabout. So he'd gone without food for a while. We don't know how long he'd gone without food, but when he came back, he was starving, and we said, I'm faint. What he means is, it was unsuccessful. I'm a cunning hunter, but I didn't kill anything. So I've been out on this trip, and I finally made it back, and I'm starving. I'm hungry. Verse 30. And let me read it from the NLT. Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew. Now, this is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. In fact, remember that he's the father of the Edomites. Edomites actually, Edom, that's Ebony. In other words, it's named after Esau, whose other name was Edom. His nickname became Red because of the stupid thing he did. Yes, he probably had red hair, and we looked at that when he was born, but it tells us why he was named Red or Edom. It's because of this story, because of what he sold his birthright for. His stupidity made him famous. Let's keep going. Now, Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of the red stew. Now, in verse number 34, we're told that Jacob was boiling a lentil stew. Lentils are kind of like a pea. And the type of lentils that Jacob used was what we would call Egyptian lentils. We don't see them around here, or maybe you guys do. Maybe you buy exotic food, but when we think of lentils, we think of ones that are kind of like peas, except they're green or brown, and these aren't. Egyptian lentils are like peas, except they're red. Here is a picture of Egyptian lentils. Yep, there it is. And when you boil them, it makes a red pea soup. Not peas, red lentil soup that looks kind of like peas. Now, Jacob was boiling this red lentil soup, and Esau wanted some. Now, because there had always been a rivalry between the two, from the time they had been in the womb, Jacob didn't want to give him any. This is just kind of the way it was. Jacob's attitude was what usually a good child is towards a problem child. Of course you're hungry. While I'm here doing what mom and dad wants, I'm learning the family business. Someone has to learn the business, and you're going to be the leader one day? You're out gallivanting around, just hunting and fishing and trying to do whatever you want to do. Of course you're hungry. And don't expect me to feed you. So Jacob didn't want to give him any. Now, in all probability, it had always been like this. They didn't share with each other because they had always been rivals. And they saw each other as rivals. And if one of them wanted something the other one had, they had to give them something in exchange for it. And they had probably grown up bartering each other or bartering with each other rather than sharing all through their childhood. So when Esau wanted some of Jacob's soup, Jacob saw it as an opportunity to get something from Esau. And he looked to see what he had, and of course it had been an unsuccessful trip. He wasn't going to use his bow. He wasn't going to use a spear or any of his arrows. So he looks to see what he has, and he has nothing. So he says, you say you're about to die. You're that hungry. Sell me your birthright. Look at verse 31. Jacob replied, first, sell me your birthright. Like, yeah, what idiot would do that? Now, does everyone remember what the birthright was? The birthright went to the oldest son, and it entitled the oldest son to two things. Number one, he received a double portion of the inheritance. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 21. I'm going to read verse number 17. Very important passage of scripture. If you want to understand the birthright, you must know this passage of scripture. In fact, if you remember one time Jesus was teaching, and someone came and said, tell my brother to share. And he said, who made me judge of you? Why did he say that? Because the law's already told us what to do. Now notice what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17. He must recognize the rights of his older son by giving him a double portion. He is the first son of his father's virility, and the rights of the firstborn belong to him. So in this case, Isaac and Rebekah only had 2 sons. And the oldest son would get a double portion. In order to do that, you took the number of sons you had and you added 1 more. So if you had 2 sons, you divided it into thirds. The youngest son got a third, but the oldest son not only got his third, but he got an extra portion. He got the other third, so he got 2/3. If you had 4 sons, you would act like there's another one, and you say 5. So you would divide it 5 ways. And each of the younger 3 sons would get 20%. But the oldest son would get his 20% plus an extra portion, which is 20%. He always got a double portion. Now, that was the first thing that he got, a double portion of the inheritance. The second thing that he received when the father passed away, he became the head of the family. He became the designated leader. He was responsible for providing for all of the unmarried women of the family, both materially and spiritually. He was supposed to be the spiritual leader of the family. That's why he got a double portion. And not only was a place of honor, but you were also expected to be the most responsible. You were supposed to be the spiritual leader. Now, let me ask you a question. Just a little bit that we've seen here. Does Esau look like he should be the spiritual leader of the family? Be honest. No. And as we continue to read through the story of Jacob and Esau, you consistently see this is a problem child that grew up to be a problem adult. Well, he had many things. Remember when Jacob came back? Well, yeah, he also received even his part, his third. Not only did he receive all of these herds of animals, but he also received servants who took care of it for him. But you'll find out that the Edomites never really amounted to much. And the reason they didn't amount to much is because they were just like their daddy. Okay, getting off. But that's what the birthright was. You got a double portion of the inheritance, and you became the designated leader of the family when the father passed away. You became the spiritual leader of the family. Now, there's a condition here. If the oldest son was irresponsible, the father had the right to give the birthright to a son who was more deserving. He did not have to give it to the older son. Why did he not have to give it? Well, the law says, yes, but there was an exclusion clause. The father had to deem the firstborn son to be responsible, to be able to fulfill his responsibility and to be the spiritual leader of the family. And if he couldn't do that, that was the exclusion. It would come in and trump Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17. Everyone with me? Now, let me give you scripture for that. Turn with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse number 1. The oldest son of Israel. Who was Israel? Who's Israel? Jacob. Remember, God changed his name from Jacob. No longer is he supplanter, but he is Israel. Israel means governed by God because he had a heart for God. So notice this is talking about the oldest son of Jacob. The oldest son of Jacob was Reuben. But since he dishonored his father by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, his birthright was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. For this reason, Reuben is not listed in the genealogical records as the firstborn son. Reuben forfeited his right to the birthright when he slept with one of Jacob's concubines. And because he was spiritually wicked and irresponsible, Joseph got the birthright. Now, if you read through here, what did it say? It was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. Why was it not given to Joseph? Because Joseph was filthy rich. He became second in command. Only one higher in Egypt to him was who? Pharaoh. Anything he wanted was his. And so when Jacob is there and he looks at his son Reuben, and we'll read that if we have time at the end. Jacob's getting ready to bless his kids. He's going to divvy out the inheritance, and he's giving a blessing to every one of them. He says, Reuben, my firstborn son, the strength of my power, you're as unstable as water. Yeah, that's what he says. And he says, I can't in good conscience give you the birthright. I'm going to give it to Joseph. And Joseph says, why would I need a double portion? And he says, bring your sons to me. And he brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And they get each a portion. Remember, the firstborn, the birthright, gave you a double portion. So he got a double portion. He was able to give each of his sons their own portion. So each son got as much as the other sons. But here's the thing that I want you to understand. The father had the right and the responsibility, because this was an important position. The oldest has to do what's right for the family. He's supposed to be the spiritual leader. He's got to take care of the women who are unmarried. He's the one that everyone's going to look to as the spiritual leader. So the father has to, in good conscience, give it to the firstborn if he knows he's responsible. But if he's not, he has the right to say, no, you're not responsible, son. I'm going to give it to, and he names the person. That's the importance of the blessing. We'll get to that. Now, Jacob knew that even though Esau was a problem child, he was irresponsible, he was rebellious, that Isaac was still going to give him the birthright. So he told Esau, if you want some of my soup, if you want some of my stew, then sell me your birthright. And Esau was stupid enough to do it, which proved that he wasn't worthy of it. Now, most of you don't quite get this, so let me actually give you an analogy to explain just how stupid this is. Let's suppose that you give one of your children a valuable heirloom, a ring that's worth $5,000. And they're having a little bit of financial problems. So they go down to the pawn store or the pawn shop and they pawn that ring, that $5,000 ring, and get $75 for it. Now they got 3 months or whatever the contract is to get it back. But when you find out, you know them. They're not going to get it back. They're going to lose a $5,000 ring and an heirloom for $75. People, this is Esau. I mean, he's going to sell his birthright, a double portion and a chance to be the leader of the family, the spiritual leader. The Messiah is going to come through the spiritual leader of the family. It's going to be passed through him, but he sells it, which proved he wasn't worthy of it. Look at verse 32. Look at his reasoning. Look, I'm about to die, Esau said. What good is this birthright to me? Now, people, he wasn't about to die. He was just hungry. He just didn't care about the birthright. You see, he was so irresponsible, all he wanted to do was hunt and fish. In his mind, well, I don't care if I get a double portion. I'll just have servants take care of that. I'm just going to hunt and fish all day. I don't care about that. So he was willing to sell it for a bowl of soup. Now, people, how pathetic is that? Verse 33. But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Now, the reason Jacob made him swear that he was selling his birthright for a bowl of soup is because no one would ever believe it. And when you swore an oath, it's kind of like swearing an oath by God that, okay, I made you this promise, but I swear by God that I will keep it. And that's the reason he swore to it. But you want to know how irresponsible he was and what he's going to do the right thing? He went in to get his blessing. We're going to find that out in the later story. And people, the blessing and the birthright went hand in hand. Because the blessing is where the father says, who gets the birthright? And he's going to give him the birthright. And guess what? Esau's going to take it. Now later on, when he finds out that he took the blessing, he goes, well, he stole the birthright too. No, he didn't. But now he comes clean. Wow. The guy's just worthless. But that's how foolish problem children are. This is just further proof that Esau didn't deserve the birthright. Now, if you remember, God knew that Esau would be this way when he was still in the womb. That's why he told Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. He reversed the Hebraism. The Hebraism was the younger will serve the older, but he came and said the older will serve the younger, and they knew exactly what that meant. It meant that the oldest should not get the birthright. You make sure that the youngest gets the birthright, and the older will serve him. Verse 34. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Now I want you to underline the word despised. The word despised is translated from the Hebrew word bazah, and it means to regard with contempt or disdain. It's nothing of value. Who cares? He couldn't have cared less about the birthright. He knew he was still going to be rich, And he didn't want the responsibility that went along with it. So at that time, I don't want that spiritual responsibility that goes along with it. And that's why he was undeserving of it. Now, here's what's interesting. Most Christians consider Jacob to be the culprit in the story. Let's be honest. How many of you're so familiar with this story, but every time you've read this story or you've heard it taught, Jacob was always the culprit of the story. He tricked Esau into giving it to him. He's the bad guy. He took advantage of the situation, took advantage of Esau. Here's what's interesting. This is the truth. There's not one place in the scriptures that ever condemns or criticizes Jacob in any way for doing that. Did you know that? That's right. In fact, the scriptures always place all of the blame on Esau. Why? Because he didn't deserve the birthright. And that was just proof of it. And God knew that. In fact, he knew that Esau wouldn't be deserving it before he's ever born. And that's why he told Rebekah, the younger or the older will serve the younger. And she knew exactly what it meant. And she told Isaac about it. But Isaac didn't want to hurt Esau. Oh, I think he'll step up. I think he'll be the person. Now, let me tell you something. Jacob learned a valuable lesson for this. So when he gets ready to bless his children, inheritance time, he's going to speak these things before God. Now, you need to understand what he always says before the Lord. And the reason it would say the blessing before the Lord is because the Lord's the judge. You know how people fight over the will? Well, back then in the Old Testament, they would do this before God, because if you started fighting over the will, this was all designated before God. Now, Jacob gets ready to do it. Turn with me if you would. Got to read this. It's not going to come up here. Grab your Bible. Turn to Genesis chapter 49. We're almost to the very end of Genesis 49. I have to get back from my Bible. And I'm going to read verses 3 and 4. Well, let's just read verses 1 through 4. Is that all right? And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. This blessing is not only going to give them their inheritance, but it's also going to foretell their future. So prophecy is built within this. Why was prophecy within this? Because Jacob was a prophet. People, he was a plain man, Tom, righteous, doing the right thing. He was a man that was doing the right thing, not only physically, but spiritually. Did he make mistakes? You betcha he did. But he was a man after God's own heart too. Now notice this. Gather yourselves together and hear ye sons of Israel, and hearken unto Israel your father, me Jacob. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, and the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Boy, he starts off good. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel. Sorry, you're my firstborn. And I was proud of you. You looked good, but you're unstable as water. You will not excel. Because thou wentest up to the father's bed, and then defileth it, thou shalt went up to my couch. And then he goes on. So that's it. You don't get it. Sorry. It's character, son. You don't get the birthright. And you go on down. Judah gets the blessing. The spiritual blessing. The Messiah is going to come through the tribe of Judah. Manasseh and Ephraim, the sons of Joseph, they get the birthright. Jacob learned an important lesson. You do what God tells you to do. Turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis, chapter 27. This is a very interesting chapter because it's the story of the stolen blessing. At least that's what scholars refer to it as. It's the story of Jacob tricking his father into believing that he's Esau in order for him to receive the blessing. And if you grew up in church, you know the story because it's one of those stories that you hear all the time. In fact, if you went to Sunday school, you covered it at least twice a year. And even if you didn't go to church, you're very familiar with the story because everyone has heard about it. But just because you know the basic elements of the story doesn't mean that you really understand it or understand what was going on behind the scenes. You see, to really understand the story, you have to understand the Sitzim Laban. Now, how many of you know what Sitzim Laban means? Well, let me explain it. Sitzumleben is a German theological phrase that literally means setting in life. And it refers to the situation or the circumstances behind a particular teaching or story, as well as the customs and traditions of that time period. So what I'm telling you is that if you don't understand the circumstances behind the story in chapter 27 and the customs and the traditions of that time period, then you really don't understand the story. And you think you know what it means, but you really don't. In fact, if most of you are honest, you'll say, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Why in the world would God put it in the Bible? So what I want to do tonight is I want to explain the Sitzumleben. In other words, I want to explain the custom of the birthright and the blessing and why they were so important and the circumstances behind the story. Because only then will you understand why the mama, Rebekah, wanted Jacob to receive the birthright instead of Esau, and why Isaac didn't take the blessing back after he discovered what Rebekah and Jacob had done, how they had tricked him and deceived him. Now, trust me, after I explain the Sitzumleben, everything will make a lot more sense. So let's start with the birthright, because the birthright goes hand in hand with the blessing. And chapter 27 is all about the blessing. And the majority of you don't even know what the blessing is. So let's start with the basics and let's begin with the birthright, because it goes hand in hand with the blessing. In that culture, at that time, the birthright normally went to the firstborn son. And people, it was a big deal. And one of the reasons it was a big deal is because the birthright entitled you to a double portion of the inheritance. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Deuteronomy, the 21st chapter, verses 15 through 17. Notice what it says. Suppose a man has two wives, but he loves one and not the other, and both have given him sons. And suppose the firstborn son is the son of the wife he doesn't love. When the man divides his inheritance, he may not give the larger inheritance to his younger son, the son of the wife he loves, as if he were the firstborn son. Now, I'm going to continue on. Just hold your place there. Does that kind of sound familiar? Do you know of anyone that had two wives? He loved the one, but he didn't love the other one as much? Yeah, Jacob, with Rachel and Leah. Had sons from both of them. So this is applied to him, but it applies to all of the Israelites. Now let's continue on. He must recognize the rights of the oldest son, the son of the wife he does not love, by giving him a double portion. He is the first son of his father's virility, and the rights of the firstborn belong to him. So the birthright entitled you to a double portion of the inheritance. Now, let me explain how the inheritance was divided. If you had two sons, you divided the inheritance into 3 equal shares. Each son got 1 share, but because the older son got a double portion, in other words, an extra share, you always added 1 share to the number of sons that you had. So let me just kind of give you a little quiz here. What would you do if you had 3 sons? You would divide it 4 ways. So if you're the father and you have 3 sons, when it came to dividing your inheritance, you would divide it 4 ways. And every one of your sons would get 1 share, except for the oldest if he had the birthright. If he had the birthright, he got a double portion. He got an extra share. So it didn't matter how many sons you had. All you did was you added 1 to the number of sons that you had, because the oldest son always got an extra share. Now, why was that? Does that sound fair to you? Does it sound fair? Why in the world would you do that? Why would you give the older son a double portion of the inheritance? Does anyone remember? It's because he assumed the responsibility for his widowed mother and all of his single sisters when his father died. So he received a double portion to take care of them. The double portion was to help him financially support not only his widowed mother, but because it was a polygamous society, there might be several wives involved. And as a result of that, you would take care of all of the widowed mothers and all of your single sisters, whether they were full sisters or half sisters. So the double portion was to help provide for them. Extra responsibility meant an extra portion. Remember it that way. But that also explains the other benefit of the birthright. There wasn't just one benefit of the birthright, there were two benefits of the birthright. You see, besides receiving a double portion of the inheritance, you also became the spiritual leader of the family. In other words, you became the patriarch of the family, the leader of your clan. And this is where it gets very interesting. You see, because of the great responsibility that came with the birthright, you couldn't risk giving it to someone who was wicked, or maybe someone who lacked character. Why? Because it would be their job to take care of all of the widowed mothers, if there was more than one wife of the deceased father, and all of the single sisters, whether they be full sisters or half sisters. And if he was not a man of integrity, he would take the double portion, but he wouldn't take care of those he was supposed to. So you couldn't risk giving the birthright to someone who did not have integrity. So the oldest son had to prove that he was worthy to receive it. He didn't just automatically receive the birthright because he was the firstborn son. Yes, he was the first in line to receive it, and he was supposed to receive the birthright, but if he lacked character, he forfeited his right to it. And another son would be selected by the father shortly before he died to receive it. Now, let me give you an example of the firstborn son forfeiting the birthright. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Chronicles, the 5th chapter, verse number 1. You know, the Bible is brutally blunt. You know, it's kind of nice if you would have your name in the Bible, but not always if your name is in the Bible, is it a good thing. Notice what this says. The oldest son of Israel. Now, who is Israel? Jacob. Israel is the name that God gave him when he changed his name from Jacob, supplanter, to Israel, which means governed by God. Same person. The oldest son of Israel was Reuben. But since Reuben dishonored his father by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, his birthright was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. For this reason, Reuben is not listed in the genealogical records as the firstborn son. In other words, because Reuben was wicked, he forfeited his right to the birthright, and Joseph received it instead. Now, why does it say that Joseph's sons received it? Does anyone know? Ooh. This is really interesting. The reason that he didn't, the reason that it was given to his sons is because Joseph was a very, very wealthy man. He probably had 100 times more wealth than his own father. Why? Because when he went down into Egypt, God so worked it, but by the time that his family comes to Egypt, he's second in control of Egypt. The only one who's greater than him is Pharaoh. And so he has all of this wealth. And so when the family comes down to Egypt and his father is there, he gives him the birthright, Joseph the birthright. But one of the privileges of the birthright is you get a double portion of the inheritance, but he didn't need it. So he has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So he brings the two sons and he says, give my oldest son my share of the inheritance and give my other son the double portion. Now, here's what's interesting. Because of that, when you go into the land of Israel, do you have a tribe of Joseph? No. You have the tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim. They make up the 12 tribes. Isn't that interesting? And then you also understand, but I'm not going to go into it, why Ephraim was the one that was always well respected. As you're reading through the Old Testament, it always talks about Ephraim. Why? Because Ephraim was not the oldest son, but if you remember, when Jacob placed his right hand, he placed it on Ephraim, and Joseph said, no, he's not my firstborn. Manasseh is. He said, no, I know what I'm doing. And he blesses him, and it's through Ephraim that the birthright is there, the patriarch of the family. So of all the tribes, which one is the greatest? Ephraim is. And that's why they're always offended if Ephraim is not included. That will help you to understand as you're going through the Old Testament. Now, we'll also help you to understand why Judah is so important and Benjamin is so important, but that's later on. But here's my point. In fact, before I give you my point, let me give you one more example of the firstborn forfeiting his right to the birthright, because I want you to understand this isn't a one-time thing. Turn with me, if you would, to 1 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 10. It says, Hosah, the Merarite, had sons. Shimri, the first, although he was not the firstborn, his father had appointed him the first. In other words, Shimri received the birthright, even though he wasn't the firstborn. Now, we don't know why he did. We don't know what the firstborn did in order to forfeit his birthright, but it had to be something bad. He did not prove himself to be worthy, and Shimri did. And as a result of that, even though he wasn't the firstborn, he received the right of the firstborn. And here's my point. Even though you were the firstborn son, it didn't guarantee that you would receive the birthright. Let me say it again, because it's so important. Even if you were the firstborn son, it didn't guarantee that you would receive the birthright. Yes, you were the first one in line to receive it, and yes, you were supposed to get it, but if you weren't worthy of it, you forfeited your right to receive it, and another son was selected to take your place. Is everyone with me? Good. Now, if you remember, Esau and Jacob were twins. And they were struggling and wrestling with each other while they were in the womb. And it really scared Rebekah. She thought she was going to have a miscarriage. So it scared her so bad she went to God. And God explained what was taking place. He said, you have twins inside of you, and they're struggling against each other. And he went a little bit further. He said, the older will serve the younger. And she knew exactly what that meant. It meant that even though the older was supposed to receive the birthright, he wouldn't. God had chosen the younger to receive the birthright. It was supposed to go to Jacob. And as the boys grew up, you could see why. Esau was lazy, irresponsible, and ungodly. In fact, he was so lazy and irresponsible, he spent his whole time hunting and fishing. He didn't stick around the house. He didn't learn the family business. No, he didn't do any of those things. In fact, if you look at Jacob, it says that Jacob was a plain man, and the word plain there is the Hebrew word tam, and it doesn't mean what we think it means. It means that he was an upright and righteous person. And then it says he dwelt in tents. In other words, he stayed around where the family was to learn the family business. So you've got this one lazy, irresponsible, ungodly son who's the oldest. He's first in line to receive the birthright. He's supposed to receive it. But he's lazy, he's irresponsible, he's even foolish. He actually sold his potential birthright. Now notice I said potential, because just because you're the firstborn doesn't guarantee that you're going to get it. But he even sold his potential birthright for a bowl of stew. And the reason that he thought he was going to get the birthright, and even his brother Jacob thought that, is because his dad was an enabler. Isaac was a poor father. He enabled his problem child. He overlooked the faults. And so Jacob said, well, it doesn't really matter how irresponsible and lazy he is. It doesn't really matter how foolish he is. I can see what dad's going to do. He's going to give him the birthright. And so when he comes in, remember, he sold it for a bowl of stew. Now, how foolish is that? And he says, swear to me an oath. Swear to me that if daddy gives you the birthright, because you're first in line, that when you receive that, you're going to give it to me for this bowl of stew. And he swears the oath. And of course, because he's not a man of integrity, we find out in chapter 27 that he had no intention of doing that. He wasn't going to live up to his oath because he wasn't a man of integrity. Now, because God knows the future, he told Rebekah that Jacob was to receive the birthright. The younger twin was supposed to receive it. And as the boys grew up, it was evident why God had told her that. Esau was not worthy of the birthright, and Jacob was. Now, let's talk about the blessing, because that's what chapter 27 is about. Most of you understand the birthright, but you don't understand the blessing. So let's talk about the blessing. The blessing and the birthright go hand in hand. And the reason they go hand in hand is because the blessing was the official sanctioning of the birthright. Let me say that again. The blessing was the official sanctioning of the birthright. It was a ceremony in which the father officially acknowledged which son was going to receive the birthright. Now, remember, the firstborn son was first in line to receive the birthright. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, it tells them if you have two wives and you love one more than the other, and they both give you sons, just because you love one more, you cannot come in and say he doesn't receive it for no reason at all. He must prove himself to be unworthy of it before you take it from him. But just because you're the firstborn didn't guarantee that you were going to receive it. You had to prove that you were worthy to receive it. So the blessing was not given until the father was close to death. Let me say that again. The blessing was not given until the father was close to death. And the reason it was is because he needed to see his boys grow up. He needed to see them in action. He needed to see how responsible they were. He needed to see if they had integrity. Did they have character? Were they lazy? Because this person was not only going to receive a double portion, but the reason he was going to receive a double portion is because he was responsible for the family. All the women who didn't have husbands, and not only that, he was to be the spiritual leader of the clan. So you couldn't have someone who didn't have integrity in that position. So the blessing wasn't given until the father was close to death. And at that time, he would prepare a big feast, or have the servants prepare a big feast, and then the father would formally acknowledge which son was going to receive the birthright. Now, most of the time, it went to the firstborn, but not every time. So it was almost like a drum roll, please. And all the sons would come, and you would have this feast, and he would stand up, the father, if he could, health-wise, and he would begin to give a blessing to each one of the sons. And then when it came to the one receiving a birthright, they received not a blessing, but they received the blessing. The blessing that sanctioned them as the rightful person to the birthright. Does that make sense? Now, let me give you a biblical example to illustrate how the blessing was given. Turn to Genesis chapter 48, verses 21 through 22. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "Look, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will take you back to Canaan, the land of your ancestors. And beyond what I have given your brothers, I am giving you an extra portion of the land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow." Now, did you catch that? I don't know how you couldn't have caught it by the way I emphasized it with my voice inflection, right? Joseph was supposed to get an extra portion of land. Do you have a tribe of Joseph? No. He had two sons. The inheritance was passed to them. So you have a tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim. So you have an extra tribe. Why? Because Joseph was to get an extra portion of land, which simply meant that he was going to get the birthright. But that wasn't official. Jacob needed to make it official. So he calls all of his sons together, and they have this big feast. And then he begins to bless each one of his sons. And it's kind of like, drum roll please. And they all receive a blessing. But only one receives the blessing. And of course, we know that it's Joseph. Turn to Genesis chapter 49, verses 1 through 28. I'm going to read through this really quickly. And you probably noticed that I have been on this speed motion. Have you noticed that? It's because we have so much we have to get through. So, stick with me as I talk fast. Then Jacob called together all of his sons and said, "Gather around me." Now, that's kind of a figure of speech, which means, come together, we're going to feed everyone, there's a feast. Bring your families in, and I will tell you what will happen to each of you in the days to come. The days to come when I die. Come and listen, you sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my strength, the child of my vigorous youth. You are first in rank and first in power. But you are as unruly as a flood, son. And you will be first no longer. Do you want to catch what he's doing? You will not receive the birthright. And then he has to say why. Because we know what the law is going to dictate in Deuteronomy. Now, this is before the law, but even then the custom dictated that you had to say why the firstborn did not receive it. Why was he not worthy to receive it? He tells us, everyone can read it in the Bible. For you went to bed with my wife. You defiled my marriage couch. Son, you're unstable. I'm sorry. You're not going to receive the birthright. Simeon and Levi's going, oh yeah, we're next. We're next in line. Here it comes. Simeon and Levi are two of a kind. Their weapons are instruments of violence. I never join in their meetings. In other words, I don't want to even hear what you plan to do. May I never be a party to their plans. For in their anger they murdered men and they crippled oxen just for sport. Ooh, they don't have character there either, do they? Would they be the good patriarchy, the one of them? Just for sport they did it. A curse on their anger, for it is fierce. A curse on their wrath, for it is cruel. I will scatter them among the descendants of Jacob. I will disperse them through Israel. And this is kind of a prophecy. You need to understand the Holy Spirit has come upon him, and he's actually prophesying. We see these things fulfilled later on through the tribes. But here's one of the reasons why. This genetic code that goes through them, hey, we need to kind of disperse them through, because you get a lot of these type of people together and bad things happen. But you've been disqualified from receiving the birthright. Then he goes further. Judah, your brothers will praise you. You will grasp your enemies by the neck. All your relatives will bow before you. Ooh, could this be the one? Judah, my son, is a young lion that has finished eating its prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the Messiah, the one whom all nations will honor. He ties his foal to a grapevine, the coat of his donkey to a choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes, which is euphemism that, okay, he's going to do righteous judgment, but it will come. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth are whiter than milk. No, he didn't get it, but you're going to be praised. And through you, the Messiah is going to come. Zebulun will settle by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships. His borders will extend to Sidon. You are going to be wonderful business people, and you're going to become fabulously wealthy. Issachar is a sturdy donkey resting between two saddle packs. When he sees how good the countryside is and how pleasant the land is, he will bend his shoulder to the load and submit himself to hard labor. Yep, he's phlegmatic. He's just a hard worker. He's steady. But you don't get the birthright. Dan will govern his people like any other tribe in Israel. Dan will be a snake beside the road, a poisonous viper along the path that bites the horse's hooves so its rider is thrown off. I will trust in you for salvation, O Lord. Dan's going to stick together, but you got to watch Dan, because Dan will strike. In fact, we know that to be true because the original portion of land that they got, they didn't stay there. And actually, they go up north. And they literally exterminate a whole peaceful tribe or a whole peaceful people in order to take that land because it's a good land, just like a snake. Okay, I trust in you for salvation, O Lord. Gad will be attacked by marauding bands, but he will attack them when they retreat. And it's so true. Where they were the first ones that they would come in, but they were very strong. They would be able to defend, and when they left to retreat, they would put the attack on and they would overcome. Asher will dine on rich foods and produce food fit for kings. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is the foal of a wild donkey, the foal of a wild donkey at spring. One of the wild donkeys on the ridge. Archers attacked him savagely. They shot at him and harassed him. But his bow remained taut and his arms were strengthened by the mighty one of Jacob, by the shepherd, the rock of Israel. In other words, it doesn't matter what people do to you. You always come up on top and you never sacrifice your integrity. May the God of your fathers help you. May the Almighty bless you with the blessings of the heaven above and the blessings of the watery depths below and the blessings of the breast and womb. May the blessings of your father surpass the blessings of the ancient mountains, reaching to the heights of the eternal hills. My, why in the world is he saying, may all these blessings come to you? Because you're going to be the patriarch. May these blessings rest on the head of Joseph, who is the prince among his brothers. There it is. We'll come back to it, and I'll show you what that means. But let's continue on. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, devouring his enemies in the morning, dividing his plunder in the evening. These are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said as he told his sons goodbye, because he's about to die. He blessed each one with an appropriate message, because this is the way the ceremony was done. All of them received the blessing, but only one received the blessing. Now, notice in verse number 26 that Joseph was designated as the prince among his brothers. We don't realize what it means because we don't understand what the word prince means. Prince is translated from the Hebrew word nazir, which means chosen to be the leader or set apart as the leader. So I want you to notice what verse number 26 is saying. May these blessings rest on the head of Joseph, who is chosen to be the leader among his brothers. There it is. You get the birthright. The double portion comes to you. Because you're so wealthy, then we're going to give your share to your oldest son and your extra share to your second son. They will be the tribes, but you will be the patriarch of the family. You will be the spiritual leader. You are the one who leads the clan. That's what verse number 26 is saying, which means that he was meant to receive the birthright. He didn't receive a blessing, he received the blessing. And that's what that phrase means. It's the official sanctioning of the birthright bestowed upon one of the sons. So, if you know that, and you understand that the blessing is a formal acknowledgement of who's going to receive the birthright, and then you understand the circumstances behind the story in verse number 27, you understand the Sitzimleben. And all of a sudden, all of the details in the story make sense. All of a sudden you're reading along and go, okay, I see that. Because we understand the circumstances. God had already told Rebekah and Isaac who was supposed to receive it. Why? Because he knows the future according to the book of Isaiah. He knows what's going to happen before it ever happens. He knew what type of character that Esau was going to have. He knew what type of character Jacob was going to have. And he wanted to make sure that they understood that one would not be worthy, the firstborn, to receive the birthright. The youngest would. Now, could not have God made it possible for Jacob to be the firstborn? Of course, he could have done that. But there's a spiritual lesson in this. People's salvation does not come because your parents are Christians, because you were born into a Christian family or into a Christian nation. Salvation is a choice. It's what you choose to do. Esau did not receive the birthright just because he was born the firstborn. He didn't deserve it. He wasn't worthy of it. Therefore, God chose the one who would choose his path. He chose Jacob. Now that you understand the Sitzimleben, let's look at the story. Turn back to Genesis chapter 27. Let's read verses 1 through 5. One day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called for Esau, his older son, and he said, "My son." "Yes, father," Esau replied. "I'm an old man now," Isaac said, "and I don't know when I may die, but it could be soon. Take your bow and a quiver full of arrows and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me." And why does he want him to do that? Well, we're going to find out because he's doing this in secret. And there's not going to be a big feast. In this ceremony, you're supposed to have a big feast. And he's going to make it as official as he can because he's not on the up and up. So go kill some wild game for me. Prepare my favorite dish and bring it here for me to eat. And then I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die. It's time for the official ceremony. But Rebekah overheard what Isaac had said to his son Esau. Now again, the blessing was supposed to be a public ceremony. Remember, the blessing is when the father officially recognized who was going to receive the birthright. So it was not supposed to be done secretly. It was supposed to be done publicly. All of the family attended. But Isaac was going about it in secret. He was doing it secretly. The reason he sent him out to kill the wild game in the first place is because, we're only going to do it with me and you, but we're going to make it a little feast just between you and I. But the question is, why was he doing it in secret? It's because he was trying to do it behind Rebekah's back. But she overhears what he's planning to do. Kind of interesting. I don't know if God meant for her to overhear it. I don't know where she was, whether she was outside the tent, in the tent, but he calls his son Esau. Maybe she just knows, something's not right. So she goes in and she listens, but she overhears he's getting ready to give Esau the blessing. And she thinks to herself, Isaac, you old dog, you know that Esau's not worthy of the birthright. You know that God told us that Jacob was supposed to receive it. He told us that before the twins were ever born. So you know that if you do this, you're going to be in direct defiance to what God has told us to do. And that's why you're being sneaky about it. And you're trying to do this behind my back. So when it's done, you can say, too late. It's already been done. Well, she thinks, if you're going to be sneaky about it, then I'm going to be sneaky. So she goes to Jacob with a plan. Look at verses 5 through 13. But when Rebekah overheard what Isaac had said to Esau, had said to his son Esau, so when Esau left to hunt for the wild game, she said to her son Jacob, listen, I overheard your father say to Esau, bring me some wild game and prepare me a delicious meal. Then I will bless you in the Lord's presence before I die. In other words, he's going to swear this oath. It's all going to be done with God, before God. Now, my son, listen to me. Do exactly as I tell you. Go out to the flocks and you bring me 2 fine young goats. I'll use them to prepare your father's favorite dish. Then take the food to your father so he can eat it and bless you before he dies. But look, Jacob replied to Rebekah, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and my skin is smooth. What if my father touches me? He'll see that I'm trying to trick him, and then he'll curse me instead of blessing me. But his mother replied, then let the curse fall upon me, my son. You just do what I tell you to do. You go out, you get those goats for me. Listen to your mother. Now, can you kind of feel for Jacob? Jacob is the good son. The Bible says that he was a plain person. The Hebrew word tam means upright. In fact, every time that it's used in the Old Testament, it means perfect or upright. It's used in the book of Job to refer to Job, that he was a plain man, that he was an upright, perfect individual. Now, we know it doesn't mean perfect in the sense that we think of Jesus as being perfect, but it means that he was a man of integrity, he was a man of character, and he was a man of the tents. In other words, he stayed at home and he fulfilled his responsibilities while Esau was out hunting and fishing. And he said, Mama, this don't sound right. And besides, why don't we wait? He's already sold the birthright. Mama's probably thinking, son, it doesn't matter if he swore that to you for that bowl of stew. He don't keep up to it. You just do what I tell you to do. And so, off he goes. Now, people, this is a dysfunctional family. They put the fun in dysfunction, right? But the reason it's dysfunctional is because they have a problem child in the family, Esau. Now, let me just give you a principle. It's true. Whenever a family has a problem child in it, that family is dysfunctional. Let me say that again. Whenever a family has a problem child in it, that family is dysfunctional. Now, let me explain why, but first let me explain what the word dysfunctional means. Because if you don't know what dysfunctional means, you're going to go, I don't get that, I don't receive that, especially if you have a problem child. Just be objective and listen to me first, okay? Dysfunctional is a compound word. That means it's made up of more than one word. In this case, it's made up of 2 words. It's made up of the root word functional and the prefix dis. Dis means abnormal. So when you put these 2 words together, it literally means that you don't function normally. In other words, you don't behave in a normal way. So a dysfunctional person is a person who doesn't behave in a normal way, and that's exactly what a problem child is. A problem child is someone who doesn't behave the way they're supposed to. So by definition, a problem child is a dysfunctional person. Is everyone with me? Can we agree on that? So the truth is, all problem children are dysfunctional. In other words, they do not behave in a normal way. They don't behave the way they're supposed to. So when you put a dysfunctional person into a family, they make the whole family dysfunctional. Even if everyone else is behaving the way they're supposed to, you have one person who's part of the family that doesn't. So the family, because it includes them, is dysfunctional. Now, how dysfunctional the family becomes depends on the parents. But normally, what will take place? You see this most of the time. One of the parents feels guilty or feels sorry for the problem child. They don't behave a certain way. They look for all these excuses. Maybe they feel like it's their fault. Or maybe they feel like it's some other reason for this. And so what they do is they start enabling the problem child, which only makes things worse. And people, that's what happened in the case of Isaac and Rebekah with Esau. Isaac enabled Esau. I'm going hunting today, Dad. Oh, good, you're a great hunter. Instead of saying, you're the firstborn, you need to stick around and you need to understand how the business works. One day you're going to be responsible for this. He probably did that in the beginning, and Esau threw a fit. And so he did like most parents with a problem. Okay, it's okay. Let's just keep everything nice. Right? So we enabled Esau. People, that caused huge problems in the family. It literally split them apart. You've got Isaac who won't admit that Esau's worthless, and he's willing to make Esau the leader of the family when he died, which is in direct defiance to what God had told them to do. And then you've got Rebekah on the other side, who's objective, and for years she's watched Isaac, her husband, enable Esau and make excuses for him, and she wasn't willing to do that. And now that it's time to acknowledge who's going to get the birthright, she wants to do what God told them to do. Wow. But here's what I want you to see. From the time they started having problems with Esau, Isaac and Rebekah were in complete disagreement with each other on how to deal with Esau. And it created a dysfunctional family. Now, how did it create a dysfunctional family, Alan? Well, let me tell you. Isaac kept things from Rebekah, and he did things behind her back because he knew she didn't approve of it. So he knew that she wasn't going to approve when he said, yeah, go ahead and go hunting and fishing, son. Or, oh, that's all right. So he wouldn't say it in front of Rebekah. When Rebekah would look, and he would go, oh, yeah. And it just ticked Rebekah off. And Rebekah knew that Isaac didn't agree with her. So that's when she really came down on Esau, when Isaac wasn't, I don't care what your father says. Here's what you're going to do, young man. You hear me? And so all of a sudden, because they're not in agreement, man, they keep secrets with each other. They do things behind each other's back. And it finally comes to a head with the most important decision of the entire family's life. The blessing. Who's going to receive the birthright? And Rebekah does something interesting. She sinks to Isaac's level and tricks him to get her way. Now again, you know the story. She tells him what to do. He goes out and he gets 2 goats. She cooks it up, and then she takes these skins that she has, she wraps it around his forearms and puts it around the neck, and puts on Esau's clothing because he smelled like the outdoors. You guys know what the outdoors is. I used to work for Southwestern Bell, worked outdoors. I would sweat. You had that outdoor smell mixed with sweat. Kind of stinks. And he comes in and he says, Father, I'm here. And he says, boy, you've come quickly and you don't sound like Esau. But he's blind or becoming blind. Come here. And he feels his forearms. Feels like Esau. Smells his raiment. Smells like the outdoors. Smells like Esau, not like Jacob. Jacob keeps himself very clean. He puts his arm around the back of his neck. Yeah, it has to be Esau. It doesn't sound like him, but it is. Maybe he's got a cold. Now, he then gives him the blessing. And this is before God. Now, here's what's interesting. Isaac knew he was wrong. He knew it was wrong to give it to Jacob. He knew it was in defiance to God. And how do we know that? Well, we know that when we read the story. Look at verses 30 through 33. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and almost before Jacob had left his father, Esau returned from his hunt. Esau prepared a delicious meal and brought it to his father. They're going to have their own little private feast. How nice. Then he said, set up, my father, and eat my wild game so you can give me, it says your blessing, but actually in the Hebrew, the blessing. But Isaac asked him, who are you? Esau replied, it's your son, your firstborn son, by 18 minutes. Now, I don't know how many minutes, but they're twins. Esau. Isaac began to tremble uncontrollably, and he said, but who just served me wild game? I have already eaten it, and I blessed him just before you came. And yes, that blessing must stand. Now, listen to me, people. That's a lie. That blessing did not have to stand. Why? Well, the reason it didn't have to stand was because sin was involved in obtaining it. Deception, treachery. And all Isaac had to do was say, whoa, 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 I've been tricked. Rebekah, Jacob, come in here. How dare you do this? And the very thing that Jacob feared, which was the curse. You have sinned in obtaining something that's precious to God. You have forfeited your right for that. That blessing is now turned into a curse. But he didn't do that. He had every right to reverse it, but he didn't. Why? Because he knew deep down in his heart what God wanted. And he knew that even though Rebekah and Jacob had tricked him, that Jacob was worthy of it, and he was God's choice. And what Rebekah had done actually opened up Isaac's eyes. And let me explain how. When Rebekah did what she did, Isaac realized that he had lowered himself to the point that he was willing to go behind Rebekah's back. But when she had found out about it and she had beat him at his own game, he found out that she was sneakier than he was. And it shocked him. You know why it shocked him? Because that wasn't like Rebekah. But it opened his eyes to what they both were doing and how bad it had become. So he let it stand. But the way he said it to make it stand caused even greater problems. You see, Isaac was not honest with Esau. Instead of telling Esau that Jacob was worthy of it and he wasn't, and being truthful and saying, son, I find you're not worthy of it. This is something that Jacob does. Wouldn't it be hard to tell your firstborn, Reuben, you're unstable as water. You'll never excel. I can't trust you to be the firstborn. Therefore, you're not going to get it. Simeon and Levi, good gosh, I don't even want to hear what you're planning. You're cruel even in fun. There's no way you're getting it. You see, instead of Isaac being honest and saying, Esau, I'm sorry. You never learned the business. You're always off doing your own little thing. You don't want to work. You're ungodly. You don't keep your oaths. Yeah, we heard that you sold your birthright. Now you're not even planning to live up to that. Instead of being honest with him that Jacob was God's choice, Isaac acted like it wasn't his decision. He tried to act like the blessing couldn't be reversed. He'd been tricked, but now it was too late. And people, that was not true. Now let me tell you what it did. It put a wedge between Esau and Jacob. Jacob goes, man, that's what Mama told me to do. But now Isaac and Isaac and Rebekah realize Esau is going to kill him the moment that Isaac dies. So they both come and say, you got to get out of here. Maybe one day he won't. And Isaac's probably thinking, why did I say that? Why didn't I just tell him the truth? I'll go tell him the truth. Well, it won't matter. Now he'll think you're lying. Let me tell you something. When you don't do what God wants you to do, and you don't stand up and tell the truth to your children, and we talked about the way to give right constructive criticism, all you do is create more problems. Your children need the truth spoken in love, the sandwich principle. I taught you how to give right or the proper constructive criticism. But when you don't do it and you enable the problem child, you just make your family that much more dysfunctional. And baby, it was. Last time that I spoke on Wednesday night, we were in chapter 27, which is the story of the stolen blessing. And the reason I refer to it as the story of the stolen blessing is because the majority of scholars refer to this story as the stolen blessing. It's the story of Jacob tricking his father into believing that he's Esau in order to receive the blessing. Now, tonight we're going to look at the fallout. In other words, the consequences of Jacob's actions, because Esau didn't take it very well. Now, the majority of us, we look at this story and we say, Jacob and Rebekah, look what they caused. See what happens when you take matters into your own hands. And it's true, they did screw up. But what most Christians don't realize, the person who carried the bulk of the responsibility for these problems was Isaac. And one of the reasons I'm going to spend so much time on this story about Jacob and Esau is because the majority of Christians don't understand the story. Now, last week I made the comment, or actually 2 weeks ago I made the comment that most of you don't know what the blessing is, and someone corrected me and said, you shouldn't say most of you because that's kind of offensive. I should have said most Christians don't understand, and then I leave it up to you and you think that I think that you understand it. And it's less offensive that way. But the truth of the matter is, I say that because I didn't understand this story for years. I had the wrong view of it. The things that I really came in and focused in on weren't really the major parts of the story, but I thought they were. When I looked at the characters and what they did, I picked out certain ones and said, well, they're guilty. And then I would look at others and say, they're not guilty. And the truth of the matter is, I wasn't really looking at the things that were important from a Jewish perspective. And so when I started studying this from a Jewish perspective, looking at the traditions and the customs, all of a sudden everything changed. Because if you don't understand the Sitzim Laban, you do not understand this story. And I didn't understand the story. And I went to church all of my life. I went to Bible college. My degree is in Koine Greek, New Testament Greek, and biblical literature. And it's funny. Until I started buying books on Jewish tradition and customs and going back and studying the culture at that time, I really didn't understand the Old Testament. So normally, I would just kind of skip over what I'm going to talk about tonight, but I want to make sure that you have a good understanding of this story, because this is kind of a foundation in the Old Testament, and the rest of the Old Testament, including the New Testament, builds on this foundation. So, turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 27, and let's read verses 41 through 45. There's only 46 verses in this chapter, but I'm saving the 46th verse for the end of the sermon. So let's read verses 41 through 45. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme. I will soon be mourning my father's death. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. But Rebekah heard about Esau's plans. So she sent for Jacob and told him, listen, Esau is consoling himself by plotting to kill you. So listen very carefully, my son. Get ready and flee to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay there with him until your brother cools off. When he calms down and he forgets what you have done to him, I will send for you to come back. Why should I lose both of you in one day? That's kind of interesting that she says, why should I lose both of you? Because she knew that Esau would allow his emotions to carry him away. And if he did murder Jacob, because of the laws at that time, and believe it or not, it was not an uncivilized area, he would also be put to death. So she didn't want to lose both sons. He gets carried away with his emotions. So this is what she says. Now, the reason that Esau was so angry over his father giving Jacob the blessing was because it meant that Jacob would receive the birthright, not him. It would be Jacob who received a double portion of his father's inheritance, not him. And it would be Jacob who became the patriarch of the family when Isaac died, not him. So of course Esau was mad when Isaac gave the blessing to Jacob instead of him. How would you like to be the oldest son? And when your father dies, you only receive 33.5% of your father's assets, and your younger brother receives 66.5% of the assets. How would you like it if your younger brother was going to be the patriarch of the family when your father died and not you? So yeah, Esau was mad because he was the oldest. So the birthright should have been his, or at least he thought so. Think about it. The reason it's called a birthright was because traditionally it was given to the firstborn. It was his right by birth. It was his right to receive those things by reason of being born first. So it was called a birthright. Now, the birthright is still recognized today in monarchies. Prince William is the future king of England and not his brother Harry. But the reason he is the future king, the reason he's first in line to receive the crown when his father, Prince Charles, who still isn't king yet because of his mother, dies, is because he's the oldest son. And unless he does something that disqualifies him from receiving the crown, he will be the future king, not Harry. It's his right as the firstborn. Which brings up an interesting point, something I've already covered, but I want to mention again. Even though the firstborn son was the first in line to receive the birthright, it wasn't a guarantee that he would receive it. He first had to prove that he was worthy to receive it. You see, nothing would be worse than to have a lazy, irresponsible, incompetent person become the patriarch of the family, become the leader of the family. People, that would be a disaster. So to prevent that from happening, the firstborn son had to prove that he was worthy to receive it. And people, that took time. That's why the father did not actually give out the blessing until he was old in life and he thought he was going to die, because he needed time to make sure that the son who was supposed to receive it was truly worthy of it. And if he wasn't confident that he was, he would simply continue to wait to make sure that he was worthy to receive it. And if he wasn't worthy to receive it, he then had to look at his other sons and consider them to determine who was worthy to receive it. Now, when he found out the character of all of his sons, if the firstborn son was disqualified, then he would have to come in and choose another one. But no one really knew who was going to receive it. The firstborn thought he was going to receive it. He was first in line to do it, but no one really knew until Dad actually had an official ceremony, and he gave what is known as the blessing. In fact, that's what the ceremony was actually referred to. It was referred to as the blessing. Now, there were two reasons why it was called the blessing. First of all, receiving the birthright was truly a huge blessing. Imagine attending a ceremony where you're officially recognized as the recipient of the birthright. So now it's official. You're not only going to receive a double portion of the inheritance, but you're also being named as the future patriarch of the family. People, that is a huge blessing in and of itself. The second reason, though, it was called the blessing was because of the way the proclamation was made during the ceremony. Remember, this was a huge deal because one of the sons was going to be named as the patriarch of the family when the father died. So the father would make a mini speech which always included two parts. The first part was an explanation of why the recipient was worthy to receive it. The second part was a special prayer invoking God's blessing on the recipient. Now, it didn't matter if the firstborn was going to receive it, you still did the first part. You still had to, in this ceremony, in this mini speech, explain why he was worthy to receive it. And then you would have a prayer invoking God to bless the future patriarch of the family because you want God's blessing on him as he leads the entire family. Now, look at the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob, but he thought he was giving it to Esau in verses 27 through 29. Turn back there and let's read it. So Jacob went over and kissed him. And when Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he was finally convinced and he blessed his son. He said, the smell of my son is like the smell of the outdoors, which the Lord has blessed. From the dew of heaven and the riches of the earth, may God always give you abundant harvest of grain and bountiful new wine. May many nations become your servants and may they bow down to you. May you be the master over your brothers and may your mother's sons bow down to you. All who curse you will be cursed and all who bless you will be blessed. Now, did anyone notice that something is missing here? Anyone notice that? Anyone see what's missing? If you did, go ahead and raise your hand. What was missing? He didn't do the first part in the speech. He didn't give an explanation as to why he was worthy to receive it. Now, why didn't he do that? Well, I'll tell you why. It was because he thought he was giving the blessing to Esau, and Esau wasn't worthy of it, and he knew it. See, there are two things that are glaring to any Jew. Now, today when I say any Jew, the majority of Jews don't know their culture because rabbinic Judaism has changed. It is completely different than the way it was at the time of Christ and in the Old Testament. But any Jew who's familiar with this, there were two things that were very glaring. First of all, this was not a public ceremony. Where's the big feast? We want everyone in the family, including the servants, to be here because they need to know who's been chosen to be the future patriarch of the family, who gets the double portion of the inheritance. This needs to be told. But the second thing that was glaring is he didn't give an explanation as to why he was worthy to receive it. So what he did was he skipped this part and he went right to the prayer invoking God's blessing upon him. In fact, I want you to notice the blessing that Joseph received, and then I want you to compare the differences. In fact, let's do that. Turn with me if you would. We're going to jump up ahead to Genesis 49, verses 22 through 26. And in this, I want you to notice that this is the ceremony. All of the sons are there. It's kind of sad, but he has to tell Reuben, his firstborn, I'm sorry, son, you're as unstable as water. You can't be it. You went and slept with one of my concubines. That disqualified you. So all the other sons are like, ooh, who's going to get it? And of course, he starts going down like you normally do. But he gets to Joseph, and Joseph is going to receive the blessing. It's not a blessing, it is the blessing. It's the whole reason we're here. It's what we all want to know. Who's going to be the future patriarch when Jacob dies? Who gets the double portion? Who's the spiritual leader? So let's look at the mini speech given towards Joseph. Joseph is the foal of a wild donkey. The foal of a wild donkey at a spring. Now, let me just say this. Springs are normally very slippery. Throwing this in so you'll have a little understanding. There's usually moss where the water grows, and so it's a very slippery place. One of the wild donkeys on the ridge. In other words, on the cliff. Archers attacked him savagely. They shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained taut and his arms were strengthened by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the shepherd, the rock of Israel. May the God of your father help you. May the Almighty bless you with the blessings of the heavens above and blessings of the watery depths below and blessings of the breast and womb. May the blessings of your father surpass the blessings of the ancient mountains, reaching to the height of the eternal hills. May these blessings rest on the head of Joseph, who is prince, the chosen leader among his brothers. Now, verses 22 through 24 is the part that explains why Joseph is worthy to receive the birthright. Most of you probably didn't pick that up because, man, this is crazy. It's about a donkey and an archer, and right? So let's read it again, because this is the explanation of why Jacob chose Joseph to receive the birthright. Joseph is the foal of a wild donkey, the foal of a wild donkey at a spring, one of the wild donkeys on the ridge. Archers attacked him savagely. They shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained taut and his arms were strengthened by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the shepherd, the rock of Israel. Of course, he's saying this, but he is Israel. He is Jacob when he's giving this. Now, first I want you to notice that he compared him to a donkey. Now, that might seem strange to you, seem kind of strange to me, but you need to understand that that was a great compliment because donkeys are more sure-footed than horses. So in Israel, they were more valuable than horses because Israel has many mountains. It's very mountainous, and you couldn't afford to stumble because if you stumbled when you were on one of the ridges and one of the mountains, you were going to die. So in comparing him to a donkey, he was saying that Joseph was sure-footed and he didn't stumble in difficult times. In other words, even when he was in these difficult times, he didn't make stupid mistakes. He didn't do stupid things. He was sure-footed. And the best way you could to compare him to was to a donkey. In verse 24, he talked about Joseph remaining strong and steadfast in tough times. And he compared him to a strong warrior who didn't retreat when he was attacked. He didn't go backwards. He didn't move to the side, but he remained steadfast. He stayed in the thick of it and he kept fighting. His bow remained taut. He continued with his arms strong. It didn't matter how savagely they attacked him. He remained and he continued to fight. And that's why Joseph deserved the birthright. He took everything that the world threw at him and he didn't retreat. He didn't back off. He didn't turn his back on God and give up. No, he continued to serve the Lord, and in the midst of it, he overcame. His brother sold him into slavery, and he went into a foreign country, was sold to Potiphar. He rose to the top of the house in Potiphar's house until he was falsely accused of rape. Then he was thrown into prison. And in prison, he was able to interpret the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. And of course, they forgot all about him. But one time when the Pharaoh had this dream and it really disturbed him, the cupbearer remembered that there was this guy in prison. And he had risen to the rank of second in command of the prison. Still a prisoner, but he was now like a jailer. He took care of everything because God always blessed him. So he brings him out. They clean him up and he comes before Pharaoh. And he's never lost his confidence in God. He's seen God do wonderful things in the midst of all the horrible things that have happened to him. And he's able to interpret the dreams. God gives him the interpretation. And what does Pharaoh do? He puts him second in command. No one is greater in Egypt with the exception of Pharaoh. And Joseph brings his whole family down when there's this famine. And they begin to multiply in the area of Goshen. And so when Jacob's ready to die and he brings him in here, he says, man, you are like a donkey in the spring where it's slippery. That donkey never loses its footing. When he's on the ridge, you can count on him. Doesn't matter how tough the terrain is, he doesn't stumble. You are like a warrior. When you're being savagely attacked, you continue to fight, and you have prevailed. That is why you've been chosen to receive the birthright. Now, verses 25 through 26 is the prayer that invokes God's blessing upon him. Let's read verses 25 and 26. May the God of your father, Jacob's letting him know, you had the same faith that I have. May the God of your father, because I'm your father, help you. May the Almighty bless you with the blessings of the heaven above and blessings of the watery depths below and the blessings of the breast and the womb. May the blessings of your father surpass the blessings of the ancient mountains, reaching to the heights of the eternal hills. May these blessings rest on the head of Joseph, who is chosen to be leader among his brothers. So as you can see, this is a prayer invoking God to bless the future patriarch of the family. So there were two parts to the blessing. And this is what you have to understand. The first part explained why the recipient was worthy to receive the birthright. And the second part was a prayer, invoking God to bless him as the future patriarch of the family. But my point is this. Isaac is going to bestow the blessing upon Esau in secret. And there should be a big, huge public ceremony, but he doesn't do it. And he doesn't do the first part. He actually skips the part where he explains why Esau is worthy to receive it. And he goes right into the part where you invoke God's blessing on the recipient. Why did he do that? There's only one logical conclusion. Because it was always given in two parts. Always. And that was because he knew Esau was not worthy of it, but he was going to give it to him anyway. Remember, he thought he was blessing Esau, not Jacob. Now, every Jew would have caught this because they knew there were two parts to the blessing. Now, let me shift gears here and give you three reasons why Esau should not have received the blessing and Jacob should have. And why, when you see these three reasons, Isaac knew Esau shouldn't have received it. So let me give you these 3 reasons. You should already know them, but I want to reinforce them. If you walk out of here, you should be able to tell anyone, well, there's 3 reasons why Isaac should not have given Esau the blessing, and he should have given it to Jacob. So let me give you those 3 reasons. Reason number 1, obviously, he wasn't worthy of it. If you remember at the very beginning of the story, we're told that Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Now, we've always been taught by our pastors and Sunday school teachers that meant he was a man's man. Oh, yeah, big and burly and strong. No. This means he was lazy and irresponsible and very rebellious towards his parents. You see that word for men of the field? That word field means uninhabited. He liked to go on what we would probably call walkabouts. He wanted to go camping out, hunting trips, go where no human was, and he would want to hunt these. So instead of doing what he was supposed to, he was always going off to hunt and fish, which simply meant that he wouldn't work because he was lazy. And any Jew at that time reading that, oh, he's a cunning hunter, he's a man of the field, will go, oh, he doesn't stay at home and work. Because let me tell you, in that society, you had to work. But he was lazy, irresponsible, and rebellious towards his parents. Didn't matter if they told him what to do something. He didn't want to. He just went off and did his own thing. Jacob, on the other hand, was a plain man dwelling in tents. I told you that the word plain is translated from the Hebrew word tom. Every time that it's used in the Old Testament, with the exception of this time, it's either translated as righteous, upright, or perfect. In fact, this is the very word that's used in the book of Job to describe Job. So when it says that Jacob was a plain man, it didn't mean that he was homely. It meant that he was a righteous, upright, perfect man. The phrase dwelling in tents doesn't mean that he was a mama's boy. We kind of think that. What it meant is he didn't go camping out places. No, he stayed at home. He dwelt in tents. He learned the family business. So right from the very beginning, we go from their birth where we see that God has chosen the younger to receive the birthright to all of a sudden they're young men. They're in their early 20s. And now we understand what their character is because he describes them in this way. So right from the very beginning, we are told that Esau was lazy, irresponsible, and rebellious. He did what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it. And he was a stark contrast to Jacob, who was a righteous, upright, perfect man. Big difference. And every Jew understood that. The second reason he shouldn't have received the birthright was because it wasn't his to receive. We looked at the story where he sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. Now, no one would believe this. So if you remember, what did Jacob have him do? He knew, gosh, my brother's an idiot. And this idiot is going to be the patriarch of the family. So when he comes, he says, I'm dying, give me some stew. And probably he'd been on this camping trip and hadn't killed anything. So he was very hungry and very weak. And Jacob said, I'm going to take advantage of this because he's an idiot. He could probably go to the next tent. Mama would give him some bread. He says, sell me your birthright. He says, okay. Why? I'm going to die anyway. In other words, it's a long ways off. Who cares? He didn't even think about the future. Sure. And Jacob realizes, yeah, you're just saying that. Swear to me. I mean, he gives a legally binding oath. The implication is God is invoked in this oath. So it's legally binding. So the truth of the matter is, he did not own the right to the birthright. He sold it. Even if he received it, it should have gone to Jacob anyway because he sold it. And last but not least, the reason he shouldn't have received the birthright was because God had specifically told Rebekah and Isaac, because she surely told him, that Jacob was to receive it. Because if you remember, she thought something was wrong. She was going to miscarry. She hadn't been able to get pregnant for years. And then he goes and prays for her. Isaac does, and she gets pregnant. But I'm telling you, something's not right in here. So she goes away and she seeks God. And God says, hey, there are 2 children, 2 nations inside of you. And they're rivals. And they are warring within you. But the younger, or I should say, the older will serve the younger. And she knew exactly what it meant. That was a Hebraism. It meant that the younger is the one that's going to receive the birthright. Now, I'm sure she didn't go and just keep that to herself. No, she went home, and Isaac probably said, what's wrong? Did the Lord reveal it to you? And he said, yes. There's 2 kids in here. I'm going to have twins. And they're fighting with each other. And you know what God told me? God told me that the older would serve the younger. In other words, the younger will receive the birthright. So God told Rebekah before Esau and Jacob were even born that the older would serve the younger, which meant the younger was supposed to receive the birthright. And Isaac knew that. So wanting to give Esau the birthright was in direct defiance to what he knew to be God's will. So what I'm trying to tell you is even though Rebekah and Jacob were wrong, dead wrong, can't excuse their actions, Isaac was at fault. And he was at greater fault because he was in direct defiance to God. And any Jew reading the story, understanding the traditions and the customs of the time, is reading this and going, oh my, Isaac really screwed up. And the problems in this family comes from the father not dealing with the problem child and the way that he should have dealt with him. Wow. Because he knew Esau didn't deserve it. He knew Esau had sold it to Jacob. He knew that God wanted Jacob to receive it, and yet he was still going to give it to Esau. So Isaac was to blame more than anyone else. And the truth is, most Christians don't know that, but Jews do. Now let's get back on track. Look back at verses 41 and 42. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing, and Esau began to scheme. I will soon be mourning my father's death. When dad's gone, then I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. What he didn't know is, man, he continued to live on. But Rebekah heard about Esau's plans, so she sent for Jacob and told him, listen, Esau's consoling himself by plotting to kill you. The truth of the matter is Esau couldn't keep his mouth shut. He was the type of person that when he was mad, everyone knew he was mad. And when they said, Esau, what's wrong? He said, don't worry about it. But eventually he couldn't keep to himself. He had to tell people, when dad is dead, Jacob will be dead too. I'm going to kill him. And Rebekah heard about it. Now, here's what's interesting. Rebekah knew her sons. Sometimes we get the impression that, gosh, Rebekah didn't even like her own son. No. As we read the story, she loved Esau, but she just knew his character. And she knew it wasn't just talk. If he said he was going to kill Jacob, he was going to kill Jacob. So she sent for him and she told him what Esau was planning to do. Now look at verses 43 through 45. So listen carefully, my son. Get ready, get your things together, and flee to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay there until your brother cools off. When he calms down and forgets what you have done to him, I will send for you to come back. Why should I lose both of you in one day? Now here's what's interesting. She doesn't want him to kill Jacob, but she doesn't want to lose either of them. Why should I lose both of you? What this tells us, she loved Esau dearly, but she wasn't blind to his character. Now, the interesting thing about this is Rebekah knew that Esau never stuck with anything for very long. And eventually, he would get over his anger and move on. But until then, Jacob needed to be out of sight and out of mind. And the best way to do that was to tell him you need to go away for a while. So she told Jacob to flee to Haran. Now, Haran was about 400 miles away as the crow flies. It's about 500 miles as you follow the road. Next week, as we're going in chapter 28, we'll look at the path that he would have taken. But here's the interesting thing. It would have taken him at least a month to get there on foot. Now, is Esau such a bad guy that you don't just have to get out of sight and out of mind, but you got to go 400 miles away as the crow flies? No, not at all. Rebekah had another reason, and so did Esau, for sending Jacob to Haran. She wanted Jacob to find a wife there. So she had an ulterior motive, and so did Isaac, for sending him to Haran, which explains why verse 46 is added. Because why in the world would you put verse 46 in here? Let's read verse 46. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, here she's told her son to leave, but he hasn't left yet. Just get your things ready. Then she turns to Isaac and she says, I'm sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. Now, you need to understand why she's saying this. Let's read between the lines. Isaac's heard about it too. He knows his son. You're right. Rebekah's heard about it. She's the one that sent for him. She then went to Isaac and she said, have you heard what Esau says he's going to do? And he says, yeah, let's get him out of sight, out of mind. He'll cool down. But then she comes to him and she says, I'm sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. I want to send him 400 miles away. Is what she's saying. This is thrown in here because the person writing this wants you to know just how worthless Esau really was. Well, wait a minute. I thought you said he wasn't going that far away because Esau wasn't that bad that he would travel. No. There's another reason. And there's a reason it shows us how worthless he really was. And to make sure that we understand beyond a shadow of a doubt that Esau was not worthy to receive the birthright and Isaac should have never even considered giving it to him, they threw verse 46 in here. She turns to Isaac and she says, and I don't just want him to leave and go to the next town. I am sick and tired of these Hittite women. And I will not have him marry another. And Isaac is feeling really guilty about now. Because at this point, he realized he screwed up the entire family because of the way he raised a problem child. It's his fault. Wow. Now, how do you know that? You're saying these things, but there's no proof. Well, you see, in their culture, marriage was arranged by the father. But the father wouldn't even consider arranging a marriage for a son until the son was mature enough to get married. How many of you have ever had a child that, man, they fall in love when they're 14, 15 years old and they want to get married and you're going, oh my gosh, son, you couldn't even support yourself, let alone marry. Well, it wasn't so much that he couldn't support himself, but in that culture, the father wouldn't even consider arranging a marriage for son until the son was mature enough to have a healthy relationship and to get married. And it was tradition that the oldest marry first. Oh yeah. Remember the story of Rachel and Leah? It wasn't just for women. It was for men also. Now, Esau wasn't mature enough to get married. But Jacob was. But again, traditionally, the oldest marries first, and that's why Isaac has failed in his obligation to make arrangements for Esau and Jacob to marry. And people, they're 40 years old at this time. They're not 20, they're not 25, they're not 30, they're not 35, 40! And you're looking at it and you're going, boy, Isaac really failed us. No. He didn't fail in the way you thought. He was not going to arrange a marriage for his sons because the oldest had to marry first until they were mature enough, and Esau wasn't mature enough, and Jacob was. Jacob was ready, but Esau wasn't. So Isaac didn't seek brides for them thinking that this would force Esau to grow up, but Esau refused to grow up, but he also refused to wait. So Esau took matters into his own hands and he married Canaanite women. He didn't wait for his dad to arrange it. Look back, if you would, at Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 and 35. At the age of 40, Esau married two Hittite wives, Judith the daughter of Beri and Basemath the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. People, Esau was 40 years old and he still wasn't mature enough to get married, and that's why Isaac had not gone back like Abraham did to find and arrange a marriage for his sons. But Esau didn't care what his dad thought. He wasn't going to wait any longer. So with or without his dad's permission, he'd just go get his own brides. And he went out and he married 2 Canaanite women. Now, again, Jacob was the plain man. Hebrew word is tam, upright, perfect, righteous. He is a man who dwelled in tents, learned the family business. And he was an obedient child who did not take matters into his own hands, even though it was Esau's fault, not his. And he patiently waited for his father to choose a mate for him. And that's why verse 46 is thrown in there. It's meant to reinforce how much of a problem child Esau was and how good of a child Jacob was. Because now when it's time to go, and he says, well, Jacob just needs to go to the next town. Out of sight, out of mind, it'll be all right. And Rebekah says, oh man, you don't get it. He wouldn't wait on you, and he went and got 2 Canaanite women, and they've made our life hell. I'm to the point where I'm sick of living. And I will not have him marry a Hittite woman, anyone from Canaan. And she says, this is a good time for him to go to my brother Laban and get a wife from there. So, when Jacob needs to get out of town for a little bit, Isaac and Rebekah decide to send him to Haran to marry an acceptable bride. Now, here's what's interesting. To show how much they trusted him, they weren't even going to make the arrangements. In a culture that you made the arrangements. Instead, they're sending him up there by himself and allowing him to choose his own bride. Now we look at him and go, he's 40 years old after all. That didn't matter. Do you remember when Abraham, he got to the age where he couldn't make the trip, so he sent his trusted servant as a representative? And he said, I'm praying, I know God will lead you to the right person. He didn't send Isaac to choose a bride. No. You didn't leave it to them. He sent him up there. But here they are sending Jacob on his own and giving him the freedom to make his own arrangements and to choose his own bride. But the reason this is thrown in here, verse number 46, is just to illustrate one more time just how much of a problem child Esau was, and how unworthy he was to receive it, and how good of a child Jacob was and was worthy to receive it. And every Jew reading this story would have gotten the point. But Christians, not knowing Jewish tradition and putting our arms out at arm's length and saying, no, we don't want to learn that. This is all New Testament. We don't understand, and so we read our own meanings into these stories. But every Jew understood the customs and understood exactly what this story was doing and why verse 46 was put in there again. So here's what I want to do. I want to read verse 46 again and the next verse, which is chapter 28, verse 1. Notice what it says. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. So Isaac called for Jacob, blessed him, and said, you must not marry any of these Canaanite women. Now, I'm going to add, because you can read between the lines, you must not marry any of these Canaanite women like your brother did, without our permission. Now, I know I've spent a lot of time on the story, but the reason I have is because you really need to understand the story to see why God never once comes in and says, Jacob was wrong. He never once comes in and says, I can't believe you did that, so I'm not going to bless you. He didn't do that. In fact, 3 days later, he's going to have an unbelievable experience with God, because God wants to confirm, you are my choice. I've seen your character. I saw it before you were ever born, and I will do great things with you. Now, knowing that, we're going to have the story of Jacob, and we're going to see what a good man he was.